Hey everyone, Lee with LG Speed and Custom here, and in this video we are converting the 47 Ford to an open driveline. So in the last video on this car, we removed the stock Ford 3-speed transmission and put a T5 5-speed transmission in. This means that in this video, we have to convert this car to an open driveline. So what does that mean? What's an open driveline? Well, from 1948 prior, like older than 1948, Ford cars used a torque tube driveline, meaning that there was a fixed tube to the rear end that pivoted with like a ball and socket deal on the back of the transmission, and inside of that fixed tube was a solid bar that worked as the drive shaft. Basically the same as a drive shaft as we know it now, only you couldn't physically see it spin. It was inside a round case. Now, since we have put this 5-speed transmission in, it is not equipped to receive a torque tube style driveline. Now, there is people that have made kits to modify the T5 to a torque tube. However, it's so much easier just to convert the rear end to an open drive line than it is to change the transmission. So what that means is we got to take the torque tube assembly off, which we've already done in the first video, and then there's an adapter that goes on the splined ends on the input shaft of the rear end. So this kit is kind of based off of a Ford product in 1946, I believe. So that's when they first started using open driveline on trucks, and they used the same banjo rear end, but with the drive shaft. So back 60 years ago, when these were still readily available in the auto wrecker, you could just go to the auto wrecker and get the yoke off of a pickup rear end, put it on this rear end, put a normal drive shaft in. These cars aren't in auto wreckers anymore. They haven't been for decades. So there's a few companies that make an aftermarket yoke. It's basically the same as the Ford one, only it's made today. And that's what we're going to put on this. Where it gets weird, well, hold on, let's back up a bit. When we put that on there, then we can put just a normal drive shaft in this, like every Ford car from 1949 to present day uses, minus front wheel drive cars, obviously. So where it gets weird is Ford's rear suspension is a wishbone suspension, and what that means is it has two wishbones that meet together in the middle and attach to the torque tube. The torque tube is the main structure in that rear end assembly. The rear end, it pivots up and down and side to side on that torque tube. All the wishbones do is stop the rear end from moving sideways, left and right. When you take that torque tube out to put a drive shaft in, you got nowhere to put the wishbones anymore, and that makes things weird. So that's the big hurdle that we have to, work through on this. Hot Rod Works, that made the open drive kit, they also make a wishbone mount relocation kit. However, they don't make it for the 47 Ford, and I didn't realize this until we got into this project, that the 47 Ford has considerably shorter wishbones than most early Fords. So what we're gonna do in this video is we're gonna pull the rear end back out. I've already gone underneath and taken a couple measurements and come up with a plan of what we're gonna do. So we're gonna pull the rear end back out. We're gonna split the wishbones a little bit wider, extend them, and make a new mount that's going to attach to the Hot Rod Works kit.
So underneath the car here, you can see just behind the X member where the transmission is, I've got this bracket vice grip here, and it's basically just a piece of like 3/8 plate with a Heim joint in it. Over here, we've got our original 47 Ford wishbones, and this is the part that used to mount to the torque tube, and the torque tube would go from the pinion on the rear end, big long tube all the way in there and bolt to the back of the original transmission. So I had two plans. First plan was, let's make a different bracket and relocate it back here. However, we're gonna start getting in the way of, like, there's gonna be a drive shaft going through here, and we don't want this bracket to interfere with the drive shaft at all. The other thing by having them back here rather than here is when these are shorter like this, it affects the ride. The longer your links are, the smoother the ride is, and the less motion change as the rear end is going up and down. When you're going over bumps, it's going to pivot here, and it's going to be creating an arc going up and down like that, which is going to change your pinion angle as it goes up and down. Now, in the real world, it doesn't really change it enough that it's affected. However, as we're building it, by making this longer, the longer they are, the less change there is, because the less like motion there is back there. But mainly it's for, we're moving this forward for drive shaft clearance and to improve the ride.
I've got the rear end set up on the table here. I've done some measuring and some calculating and some math, and we need to extend these wishbones 12.5 inches on each side to get the desired length that we want. And I've been trying to figure out how I can extend them and split them and keep everything symmetrical and straight and square. And then it hit me. I'm just gonna bolt the torque tube back on, because the torque tube is nice and sturdy. It'll keep it straight. It's got a little tang right here that these originally mounted to, so I can possibly even make like a temporary one 12.5 inches further down, tack weld it onto the torque tube here, and then just build our wishbones to fit that tab. So I've dug this out of the, I don't want to say the scrap pile because I don't scrap this stuff, I save it for future projects, but I went and got it from outside. So here's the actual torque tube itself. And then here is the drive shaft. Super gross, super dirty. That's why I got gloves on, but yeah, so essentially, stay. Here is our early Ford drive shaft. This coupler right here attaches on the splined ends. And then this end up here is also splined, and it slides into the U-joint on the back of the transmission. This spins like a normal drive shaft. This stays permanent. I'm not sure what it is with the taking early Ford transmissions and rear ends apart, but whatever oil or grease or both that's used in them, it just reeks. It always has. Like every early Ford I've worked on, they always stink. And no matter how many times you wash your hands, like it lingers in your skin for days. It's not a nice smell. Got the torque tube bolted back on, and I went ahead and flipped it upside down so that it's easier to work on. So here's where they originally mounted. Before I pulled the rear end back out from under the car, I measured from this point to where the Hot Rod Works cross member is with the Heim joint, and it was 14.5 inches ahead. So what I've done is just tack welded a little tab 14.5 inches ahead on here. And now we can build our wishbones or modify our wishbones to come to this point rather than this point and keep everything square and symmetrical. So this is just tubing. Well, not quite. It's tubing as in like it's hollow, but it's not round. It's oval shaped. And it's got solid ends welded on. So I think I'm gonna cut these ends off, bolt them back on here, so that I know where they are. Hopefully this isn't in the way. This is the original brake bracket, but I mean, we can modify that if we have to. So yeah, we'll bolt these guys up here and then just, you know, basically connect the dots. I don't know if we're gonna need to heat these and bend it, or if they will bend just on their own. I'm thinking probably heat, just to keep it a little bit easier.
So I cut these not quite on the end. I cut them further back, that far back to be exact. What is that? I think that was like 1.5 inches or whatever. And the reason for that is so that this tubing will almost slide inside. I think once I take the burrs off, it'll go swoop in there, and this will slide in there. Oops, there's a hole right there. Then we've got some 1.25 inch tubing, which happens to be the same size. So that's how we're going to get out of there. That's how we're going to extend this. We're going to put some 7/8 DOM inside, probably about that far on each side. Weld it, then slide this over, weld it, grind it all smooth, and it'll look great. Our ends up here, like I thought, they're gonna hit this, so I might just trim this back or maybe even cut it off. I can cut it off and weld it back on if I ever use this in the future. And then we can fit that on there and start extending it. The only problem with this plan is this is all I've got for 1.25 inch DOM right now. And the store that has it is about 40 minutes away, and it's almost the end of the day, rush hour traffic right now. So we'll go get some in the morning. All right, day 2. We've got our 1.25 inch DOM. Jim went and picked it up this morning. I took our smaller DOM. I thought this was 7/8, but it's actually 1 inch DOM. I cut it into little 3-inch strips, or 3-inch lengths. And what those lengths are gonna do is slide in just like that. Notice I've also drilled holes through here. And those holes are so that we can slide this in, weld around here, and then go and weld each one of those. Those are called rosette welds, and it's basically like a spot weld, and it just gives you another surface to weld. So we've got one of these for here, one for there, and then we've got 2 more to go into the ends of these guys, like so. Gonna fit those on there now, and then we can heat and bend these out. According to the math, so like I said yesterday, we had to move from under the car. I measured from here to where the new mount is, and it's 14.5 inches, which I figured the math out using my computer because I don't do calculators. I'm a computer guy. Anyways, from here to here would be 12.5 inches by the time you bend that over. So 14.5 to here means 12.5 on here. I think I'm going to cut our tubing at maybe 12, maybe just 12. And then we can have like a 1/4 inch gap in here so that, where'd our little scrap piece go? When we slide this together, hold on. Come on. There we go. There must be a burr on the other end. If we have a 1/4 inch gap there, then we can fill that gap with weld, which will make it, an even bigger, better, stronger weld. Also, by cutting it a little bit small, we get a little bit of wiggle room in case we need to, maybe my 12.5 inches isn't right, although computers usually don't lie. Anyways, that's where we're at. I cut one piece of our tubing here, so we got to go from here over to here. And we need heat. We got to heat this. All right, that worked really good. I've got this one mocked up here. We got about a 1/4 inch gap there and a 1/4 inch gap there, and we're right where we need to be. I'm going to have to heat this up now with the torch and just fold it back ever so slightly, but that's to be expected because we changed the angle down there. So naturally this angle is going to change as well, but that's no big deal. I just heated this up with the torch and it's perfect. There we go. We are bolted nice and tight where we need to be. We've got even gaps in between there. So I cut this at 12 1/4. Probably should have cut it at 12 1/2 like the computer said to do. But we can fill those gaps and it'll be fine. We'll just use a nice thick rod. I've already rosette welded one end of each piece, but I haven't done the second end yet. So our next step now is we'll just weld everything up.
Our wishbones are all welded up. That's completely done now. But we still have one more step to do. If you remember at the beginning of the video, I was mentioning how the torque tube is like the main component in the Ford wishbone transverse spring suspension assembly. As you accelerate, this rear end wants to tip back, and this torque tube is what prevents it from flipping all the way over. If we take this out and put a drive shaft in, all that's holding this rear end in place now is these wishbones, and they're not quite designed for this kind of motion. I've never personally seen a set break, but I've heard lots of stories about them breaking. The 35, 36 wishbones, they can hold up to it okay, but they're a totally different design than this. These ones are quite a bit smaller. So the solution is a torque arm. This torque arm bolts onto the top of the rear end here, and then on this end here, we've got a little tab that we're gonna weld to the top of the wishbone. And what that's gonna do is, what that's gonna do is triangulate it to give it just a little bit more strength. It's kind of like a lighter duty ladder bars, similar to what we're doing here. There's a lot of cars from the factory, like I think 80s Camaros all had these from the factory. But yeah, essentially this is gonna go there, and that's gonna stop our rear end from tipping back. This is also from Hot Rod Works. I got it from them just because it's cheaper to buy it from them than it is for me to build this from scratch, although it's not complicated. It's just a piece of DOM tubing, 2 heim joints on each end, and a little bracket. This one, it looks like we need to shorten it about maybe 2 inches or so, so that's no big deal. We'll just cut the end off and rethread it and thread this heim joint in a little bit further. But yeah, that's our next step in this open drive conversion.
I've got this end bolted to the rear end where it's supposed to be. And if we come down here, I've got this sitting about where it should be. So if we cut our tubing probably about there, I think should be okay. We'll cut that off and thread it so that this will thread back in, and then we can weld this tab to here. With our torque arm shortened up, it fits great. So I went ahead and put a tack on it. I think we can take this off now and fully weld that up. Probably take this torque tube out now. There's a little bit of welding I still got to do inside here that I couldn't get to with the torque tube in place. So pull the torque tube off and then we can weld the rest of that little bit up. Our torque arm is complete. That worked really good. This is all done now. While we've got the rear end on the bench, I'm gonna start installing the actual open drive assembly. So we're still waiting on the yoke to come from Hot Rod Works. Hopefully it gets here soon. It's been like over 2 weeks, so hopefully it's not lost. Here's the other piece that Hot Rod Works makes, and this is to essentially replace where the torque tube is. It bolts on here like that. It's got a seal that goes in the end, as well as a gasket. Note on the backside, it's got this little channel milled in there, and that is to line up with here, which is the drain. These torque tube rear ends, as you were driving, oil would kind of like run up the torque tube, and then when you stop driving, it would run back and drain back into the rear end through there. One thing that we need to do to this is put a vent tube in it, because like I just said, it used to go up the torque tube and then it would just drain back in, but we don't have a torque tube there anymore, so all the pressure needs somewhere to go. Now, in the past, I have always just drilled a hole in the axle tube, tapped it, put it in, and it's always made me a little bit nervous drilling holes into, like, you want it to be nice and clean. You don't want metal shavings going in there, and that's kind of really hard to do when it's an assembled unit. I had another plan. I was gonna take one of these bolts out. These are 3/8 by 24 fine thread. And I was gonna chase it with this 1/8 inch pipe thread tap, which would kind of mangle the holes up a little bit, but I think it would be okay. And we could drain or thread our vent into there. Then I had an even better idea. Why don't I just drill and tap this so that we can put the vent, if this guy sits on there like that, we can just put the vent right there. I don't see why that wouldn't work. And that way it can just, you know, the pressure will come out through here, go up through our vent, and any oil that comes out in there will just drain back in our hole like it was designed to do from the factory. So that's what I'm gonna do next, is just drill and tap this hole and then put this assembly together. That's all buttoned up. Now we're just waiting for the slip yoke to go in there. And the hole in here, which used to hold the torque tube collar on, we got a little pin and a couple set screws that are gonna go in there. So once the yoke goes on, then we can put those in, and then it's ready for a drive shaft. It's been a few days and we still don't have that piece from Hot Rod Works. But Jim has went ahead and he touched up the paint on here where we welded these on, gave the wishbones a quick little dusting of black paint, and most importantly, he made some new brake lines that are long enough now because our previous brake lines were not long enough. So this is all painted and assembled, minus this piece, but we can do that piece in the car. So now we are going to lift this off and put it back under the car, and then Jim is going to go ahead and mount this to that plate that's under the X member right now, held in with vice grips. Get it where it needs to be and drill the holes and bolt it into the X member. So Jim just slid the rear end under and jacked it up until the weight just came off the jack stand, so our spring is fully compressed. We had it mocked up here, and as the spring compressed and the rear suspension did its arc, naturally this slid back a little bit, which is fine, other than it slid back enough that our bolt holes, these are the pre-made holes, don't quite line up with the X member. Like if we drill a hole right through there, yes, we can get the bolt through, but we won't be able to get a nut on the back side because I think it's going to hit the frame rail, like the side. So that's where we're at. Okay, we've got a solution. We've got it centered in here now. This X member is not centered, which makes sense because it's got, like, I think someone drove over something at some point right here, because this is all pushed in, which has pushed the X member over ever so slightly, but that's fine. It doesn't matter. All that matters is this heim joint is centered, which it is. I've measured it from 3 different points and we're square every direction. So we got it clamped in place and marked it, and Jim is just going to drill new holes that fit this X member in the shape that it's in and not worry about using the holes that are already pre-drilled in here because they don't line up with anything anyways. So that's our solution. This is all finished up under here. Jim drilled some new holes, bolted it in, took it out, painted it black, hooked the brake lines up to the original brake hose. We're still got to deal with the emergency brake. This is the piece that I cut off the torque tube. I think I got a plan for that, but we need a turnbuckle first. But it looks pretty good in here. It's sitting on the suspension now. The jack stands are under the axle, so all the car weight is on it. Torque arm is in there. After the e-brake, all that's left is we still need this piece from Hot Rod Works, which it's getting a little weird now. I don't know what to do about that. Emergency brake system is all done. We've got both cables done. We put a little turnbuckle in here for adjustment. For the actual mount, Jim just took a piece of flat bar and bolted it onto our wishbone bracket, put a twist in it, and boom, emergency brake is done. Our slip yoke is in the back of the transmission, so that's all ready to go. It has been almost 1 month. In 2 days, it will be 1 month since I've contacted Hot Rod Works about this yoke for the rear end, and we've got nothing, absolutely nothing. So I don't know what to do on that. I'm pretty disappointed with them. I guess we'll just continue trying to reach out with them, and hopefully one day they actually get back to us or the right piece finally arrives. In the meantime, Jim has went ahead and put this dual reservoir master cylinder in. These are pretty cool. Roadster Supply makes them, and it's a dual reservoir master cylinder, but it has the correct flange on it for the factory Ford master cylinder, essentially making it a bolt-on. It does get a little bit weird with the top 2 bolts up here because they hit the reservoir as they're going in. Studs, I think, is the answer to make that work, is if we had studs in there instead of bolts. But Jim made it work as is. We got some residual pressure valves in there. Brakes are bled. They feel good. So that's more or less how to do an open drive conversion on a 47 Ford. What we've done on this basically like applies to all early Fords that use torque tube rear ends. It's just that the wishbones spacing is really the only difference. So you guys are competent hot rod builders. You can figure that out when you do yours. It's a shame that we don't have that yoke because I wanted to show you guys like the final product with the drive shaft and everything, but what can you do? What can you do?
We're almost done this project. We got a couple loose ends to tie up. We just got the speedometer cable. The speedometer cable that was in this car was broken, which was kind of a little bit lame, because for you regular viewers, you'll know that when I still own this car, I put a newer speedometer cable in it not long ago, and it only lasted like a couple months and broke. So I don't know if it was the routing was weird or if it was just a bad cable or what the deal was. But we got another one to hook the speedometer cable up to this new T5 transmission. Before we put the interior back together, it's not completely done yet. Been holding off on that because I want to put the drive shaft in. Then we can put fluid in the transmission through the shifter opening, just because it's so much easier to do it that way. So once the drive shaft's in and we have fluid in it, then we can go ahead and put the shifter in, put the carpet back in, and then that part is done. And then I think all that's left on the list for things to do on this is we got headers to go on it. RL supplied us with a set of Fenton headers. So right now this car just has a stock manifolds with an old single exhaust out the back. It sucks, it sounds terrible, it's got leaks in it. So we'll put those Fenton headers on it, and then our friend Tim is gonna bend up some cool dual exhaust out the back for it with some Porter mufflers. So that's what's left on this. Make sure to subscribe and hit notifications so that you know when the next video on the 47 Ford comes out. Thanks everybody for watching. As always, if you want to support the channel, please check out lgspeedcustom.com. Thanks to everybody that bought 47 Ford shirts from the last video. As I mentioned, once they're gone, and they're almost all gone. I think we got a couple larges left. Medium's gone, extra large is gone, 2XL's gone. They're all gone. But we have tons of other awesome LG Speed and Custom shirts on the website, lgspeedcustom.com. Anyways, gonna go work on my 32 now. See you guys later. Thanks for watching.